Good afternoon from London. You're here for this afternoon's FS Club webinar entitled Halophytes, How to Solve the Land, Water, Food, Energy and Climate Emergency whilst Generating Wealth. My name is Simon Mills. I'm a senior researcher at Zien, and in a minute I'm going to guide you through this afternoon's proceedings and introduce you to our guest speaker, Dennis Bushnell. But before I do, I'd just like to offer a word of thanks to our sponsors who not only give us a wide-ranging brief for these webinars to wander through the halls of politics, economics, science and history, but also allow us to open them to the public. If you'd like to know more about the FS Club, do drop us a line. Now, the format for today's webinar is quite straightforward. You're going to be shot of me in just a minute, and I will hand over to today's star turn, Dennis, following which there'll be time to explore some of the issues Dennis is going to raise in more depth. Now, this webinar is going to be recorded, and you can revisit it or indeed any of our previous webinars on our website. If you have got a question you'd like to put to Dennis, please use the conversation tool, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'm going to consolidate your questions whilst he's talking and then put them to Dennis at the end of his talk. And so, to today's speaker, Dennis Bushnell is responsible for technical oversight and advanced program formulation for a major NASA research center. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering and a fellow of too many societies to mention. He has, over his career, contributed to NASA programs as diverse as Gemini, Apollo, Viking, the X-15 and the Space Shuttle. And in recent years, he's been focused on atmospheric sciences and advanced power and energy. Peter, please tell us about halophytes.
Okay. Can I have the charts, please? Okay. We humans are massively and very adversely altering the ecosystem, including climate. It will take an equally massive get well program to avoid major disasters, several of them out and out existential. The only large enough, fast enough, and cheap enough approach with broad spectrum results that I'm aware of is halophytes, the 10,000 plants that grow on deserts and wastelands using saline and seawater, which is the alternative plant kingdom, which unfortunately few are familiar with. These climate and ecosystem issues are very serious. The US East Coast is flooding now. The southwest of the US is a desert, and the Colorado River that people live off of down there is drying up rapidly. Next chart, please. We are the spaceship Earth, where we're plotting the ship supplies, tinkering with the temperature and life support controls. We're still looking for the instruction manual. We know not what we've done, and engaging in bloody skirmishes. Next chart, please. Okay, conventional green energy sources. These are the things that you're familiar with: hydro, surface geothermal, solar, photovoltaics, and thermal, wind, both terrestrial and offshore, freshwater biomass. This is the safe airplane fuels. And freshwater plants are also called glycophytes, as opposed to the saltwater plants I'm going to talk about, which are halophytes. Halo means salt. And then there's nuclear, which is far too expensive, has huge waste issues, and is going out of business. Next chart. Next chart, Pete. Peter, please change the chart. Okay. Some non-traditional green energy sources. High altitude wind up in the jet stream. Massive capacity, particularly off of the US East Coast. We have worked the little windmills for the high wind up there. You know, up there, we know how to do it. Float heat exchangers in the Gulf Stream. And with all of the renewable energy whose cost is plummeting, PV is now selling for 1.2 cents a kilowatt hour in some markets and still dropping. Folks are starting to talk about energy too cheap to meter going forward. You can then use that energy to make green hydrogen, green hydrocarbons, and biomass grown on wastelands using halophytes and salt plants, saline and seawater irrigation, and also aquaculture to produce that biomass. Next chart. Peter, why does it take so long to change these charts? Okay. Hold on a minute. I got to move something for some reason. Okay. Using halophytes, seawater irrigation, and also saline on just a good portion of the Sahara is capable of providing sufficient biomass to replace all of the fossil carbon fuels, provide petrochemical feedstock for all of the plastics and other industrial chemicals, and grow all the food, because many of these halophytes, as I'll indicate, are food plants, all the food anybody will ever want to eat. And once we use saline and seawater to grow food, we get back to some 68 to 72% of the fresh water that we now use for conventional freshwater agriculture back to direct human use. The other issue with these halophytes is they are desert plants with deep desert roots, and they sequester 18% of their CO2 uptake. It goes away out of the atmosphere. Overall, this solves land, because the deserts and wastelands are some 44% of the land on the planet. So it brings into cultivation and production massive amounts of land, and that production will be sequestering CO2. Water, because we're substituting the salt water for the fresh water for agriculture, food, energy, because this is biomass, which is for biofuels, and climate, because we're sequestering CO2. Next chart. So current food production is based on freshwater plants, and we're running out of fresh water. The ecosystem is crashing. It's crashing because we are too many asking too much of it. We are currently short 50% of a planet. Halfway through the year, we drive the planet into ever greater deficit from the year before. And as the rest of the world tries to come up to Western consumption rate, we would need 3 to 4 more planets, and so that's not going to happen. A solution is to switch to halophytes, and 22 nations are already doing this, as I'll indicate. Next chart. The immense advantages of switching to halophytes: saline tolerant plant biomass utilizing what we have an absolute surfeit of. This could be our last major play regarding the ecosystem in terms of exploitation, is wastelands, deserts, 44% of the land area, and seawater, which is 97.2% of the water resources. Interestingly, seawater contains 80% of the nutrients needed to grow plants, so not much fertilizer, and researchers are developing techniques to extract nitrogen from the air for these halophytes, so even less fertilizer. No advanced technology is required. The cultivation uses very inexpensive land and water. This is a whole new economic way to do agriculture. And the economics, therefore, are very favorable. And the shift to halophytes can be done within 5 to 10 years. Next chart. Peter, it takes too long. Halophyte, cultivation for food would free up the water, and it would obviate the need to use arable land and fresh water to grow biofuels, and provide the petrochemical feedstocks for plastics, essentially removing the need for petroleum feedstocks. Halophyte biomass is literally green energy and chemicals. Next chart. Next chart. Simon, you need to fix this. It needs to happen faster. Okay. The Halophytes sequester up to 18% of their CO2. We can green much of the planet faster than we can grow trees and so forth. And we can grow halophytes in regions where trees are not going to grow unless they're halophyte trees, which exist. And the seawater contains trace elements essential to human physiology, which we've largely depleted from the arable land due to overuse and therefore have to take vitamin pills. Next chart. Why aren't we using halophytes now? Two reasons. One is big agriculture doesn't want to change from where they're making money now. And the other is humans hate change. As part of our brain, we have the amygdala that keeps us conservative, which we developed over the past couple of million years. And you know, good change, bad change, doesn't matter. Humans really don't like change, and halophytes are really big change. We need a seed catalog to grow this stuff. And you need about 33% more water of this cheap saline seawater. And in order to flush the salt, you know, back into the sandy soil where it ends up in the ocean again. And we need adult education to explain this. I'm really tired of doing lectures on this and having people come up to me afterward and say, thank you, I never heard about halophytes. We need to change that. Next chart. Then there's aquaculture, which is algae and seaweed and so forth. Doing this ponding or in buildings is too expensive. It needs to be done in open water. And the best place to do it in open water is the Gulf of Mexico, where there's a continent-sized nutrient stream from the Mississippi River efflux. The renewable energies and electrics are less efficient using green energy from biofuels than it is from PV and so forth. Next chart. Okay, water. The water on the planet is 97.5% saline and 2.5% fresh. 68% of the fresh water is tied up in glaciers that are melting and going into the ocean. 30% is groundwater. Most of the rest is in permafrost, which is melting. And the Great Lakes, Lake Baikal, 0.007% of the total water is what we mess with, spend huge amounts of money trying to conserve and clean up and everything else. Whereas with halophytes, you can have all the fresh water you want. Next chart. So water scarcity is now the greatest single threat to human health, the environment, and global food supply, says the European Union. Next chart. When you irrigate with saline salt water on these deserts and wastelands, what you do is you create a cool surface, which creates an unstable atmosphere, which creates freshwater rain downwind. Next chart. So when you have this freshwater rain, if you did this on the Sahara, then you put rainfall back in the Middle East. You stop the desertification of the sub-Sahara, and you can probably regrow the cedars of Lebanon. So all of this utilizes what we have a plethora of: wastelands, deserts, to solve, and seawater, saline water. There's huge saline aquifers, the Nubian aquifer in the Eastern Sahara, a couple others in the Western Sahara. The Agua aquifer in Texas and Oklahoma is now turning saline. It's one of the biggest aquifers in the world. Next chart. Okay, there's 10,000 natural halophyte plants. It's a rich plant kingdom. And it turns out that of our irrigated land that we're now cultivating with the freshwater plants, we have pulled so much water out of many of the aquifers that what we're now pulling is salinating the land. And so we might as well grow halophytes. Next chart. The characteristics. This is important. Their yields equal the freshwater plants. They cover the complete product spectrum of the plants, freshwater plants. For just about every freshwater plant, there's a halophyte saltwater plant. One of the most expensive foods now sold in Europe, I'm told, is a halophyte. There's halophyte seeds, roots, tubers, grains, everything. They're rich in energy, protein, and fats. Next chart. Utilization: food, fodder, biomass and energy, petrochemical feedstock, wood, CO2 sequestration, wildlife habitat. Next chart. "20 nations are indicated here that have some efforts in halophyte agriculture. There are halophyte research institutes in Pakistan and in the Middle East. Next chart. For centuries on the Indian subcontinent, there has been a very successful saline brackish water agriculture for food and fodder. There's an excellent U.S. National Academy study of all of this. This works. Next chart. The major wastelands suitable for massive halophyte production, along with a bunch of other areas like the Gobi. The dry areas on the planet are Western Australia, around the Arabian Sea, Persian Gulf, particularly southern Pakistan. The Middle East. The Saudis called me one time and said, "Dennis, what should we do with our economy going forward? People going forward may not like oil as much, and we're not sure about our, what's left down there." And I said, "Well, do you have any sand?" And they said, "Yeah, we got sand." "How about seawater?" "Yeah, we got seawater." So I told them about halophytes that I think they're looking into. The people in Texas told me that the oil wells in West Texas, which is a desert, as is the rest of the Southwest U.S., they're drying up. What do we do with West Texas? And I said halophytes. And in the poster child desert is the Atacama. Next chart. Okay, this is the last chart. The opportunity. Utilize wastelands and deserts, really cheap land. Utilize seawater, which is very cheap, inexpensive water. And by the way, these deserts and wastelands are generally very sunny, and the photovoltaics are getting really cheap. So the energy to pump the seawater and the saline water out of this saline aquifers is cheap. Also, the halophyte biomass produces plastics, which you can use to make the pipes to pump the seawater. Utilize halophytes, grow massive amounts of food and biomass, sequester massive amounts of CO2, and you can do serious amelioration of the climate ecosystem problems and a whole lot of other serious societal problems within 10 to 20 years, very profitably, because all this stuff is cheap. It's a wholly new, massive societal and planetary resource, which right now nobody's using. It's all there for the taking. And with that, I thank you for listening.
Fantastic, Dennis. That was absolutely fascinating. I do apologize for those of you who've reported technical issues. Apparently, the internet was running a little bit slow in London. I don't know if that was because this was such a popular webinar. We have got lots and lots of questions for you, Dennis, but I am going to take chairman's privilege to ask the first one. I was particularly taken with what you were saying about the macroclimatic changes that could be caused by growing halophyte crops in marginal areas. Have we got the computer modeling techniques to actually predict how these might play out?
Yes, we do. We have very large global circulation models now that are very detailed. They're being very successful, actually. That's what the IPCC uses and all the rest of them. This is, this is just a matter of petaflops rolling the machines. The Sahara is particularly interesting with regard to changing not only the microclimate, but in that case, you could change the macroclimate. Because much of the dust and other things from the Sahara end up affecting the U.S. climate and the rest of the world. So yeah, we'll have to look at that. But way before we affect the macroclimate, we will be affecting the microclimate well by producing freshwater rain. And we could do away with massive amounts of CO2 before we ever change the planet's climate much.
Absolutely, and of course the Sahara was the breadbasket for the Roman Empire, so who knows what the future might hold. Now we've got a lot of questions focusing in on the types of crops and the yields you get from those crops. So you've mentioned some of the staples that can be grown. Do these include things such as wheats and corns and rice and the starch staples? And what kind of yields are you getting from these sorts of crops?
Okay, the yields can be and have been and will be equal to what you get from the freshwater crops. The Chinese have developed a halophyte rice, which is quite successful. And the halophyte tomatoes are very tasty. So I've been working with the tech advisor to the Secretary of State in the U.S. And we have a halophyte operation near Aswan. I've been working with Boeing, and they are now growing halophytes in the UAE to produce safe aircraft fuels, because Boeing is going to go with biofuels as opposed to green hydrogen and so forth. But we have started into genomics for halophytes. And all of that is ahead of us and makes it even better. Thank you. Go ahead.
I've got a couple of questions about the risks of salinification of deep aquifers if halophyte production goes wide scale. So are there risks to aquifers?
In these desert and wastelands, most of the aquifers are saline. So you're going to pump up the growth of bloody thing. Making sure that you don't do this where you're going to contaminate the freshwater aquifers where they're still strong. That's just a matter of good engineering. Okay, there's, you have to know what's down there, and you have to, but the desert and wasteland areas are so huge. Okay, and it's producing freshwater rain. If you engineer this right, you can be much better off than you are now trying to use water holes in the middle of the desert.
Now, it's been a good 30 or 40 years since I did any pedology, but I do remember that soils are quite complex structures in their own right. What kind of impact would the use of seawater for irrigation have on soils, particularly with regards to the biomes they contain and impacts such as soil erosion, etc.? Has there been any research looking at the soil impacts of seawater irrigation?
Okay, one, these are sandy soils, most of them, okay? So they're not very productive to start with. As you grow the halophytes, their roots, which sequester CO2, all right, become green fertilizer. So you are improving them as you do this, okay? We see no, outside of the obvious, yeah, you're switching to a saline, industry for plants, and farmers are traditionally inoculated at birth that salt is horrible, okay? But by the way, there's an institute in California. California has problems with, salination, and I think it's the Brown Institute that works on using halophytes to desalinate soil, which they do. Okay, so this is again more engineering. Okay, what you're asking about in several of these questions is, well, what are the stoppers? Okay, and I've not found a stopper that's not workable with good engineering and sound science.
Which actually picks up on the theme of several of the questions that I've got here, which is why hasn't this seen wide uptake? What are the barriers to halophyte production?
Yeah, I had a chart on that. I said very carefully that one big agriculture who's doing freshwater plants, isn't terribly, favorable to it. And the other is this is a really big change, and people mostly are terminally tactical. Okay, and in fact, we knew what climate was going to do 30, 40 years ago. We hit pretty good, but it wasn't until they look out the window and see something that all of a sudden, oh my God, we got to do something, and it's really late. Okay, so I've been talking about halophytes for 3 decades now, and it's only since the ecosystem and climate impacts have become so onerous and so apparent massively now that people have become very interested in this. Okay, because it's one of the very few lifeboats we have that's at scale. Okay, you can't play with these problems because they're massive. You have to do something different with scale enough and small enough adverse effects and cheap enough, because with the renewable energy, nothing happened in renewable energy much until the cost of it went below parity with fossil carbon. Then all of a sudden it went exponential, and it's now 94% of all new energy generation. It's a fantastic thing, and the costs have plummeted because of the economies of scale and all kinds of other reasons. Okay, but it was the economics, the financials that are saving us. Okay, and with respect to the rest of the climate and ecosystem, which are the issues that I'm talking about here, okay, it's the financials that are going to save us again, I think, because this is a massively profitable thing.
Are halophytes on the agenda for COP26? Because one of the issues that's going to be discussed at the COP is climate change adaptation, particularly amongst developing economies. So do you know whether this is something which is going to be discussed? And if not, how can we get it on the agenda?
Uh, my experience, I work for various parts of the U.S. government on power and energy. And so I have lived through, developed, contributed to the renewables development. And it was the financials industry that got this thing going and serious. And the same thing will have to happen here. The people that just want to make things better, but don't have clout either politically or financially or whatever, it's harder for them. Okay. Once there's a there in terms of the financials, things happen. I've seen it. I've lived it. Okay. That's the way to do it. But we had a meeting once at the Institute for the Future out on the West Coast on the futures of energy. And we concluded that the thing we had to do, first of all, was at the time educate the population. In this case, it would be educate about halophytes and what their issues are and so forth and so on. Okay, instead of, well, I didn't know about halophytes. I don't know how to spell halophyte. Okay, that's not the situation we need. All right, we need informed politicians, informed people with influence, and we need the money people to tell them that, hey, this is important.
Absolutely. Now, I've had several questions asking about the financing of halophyte projects. Are there any commercial halophyte projects out there? And if not, how could an investment vehicle be put together to put some wings behind halophyte production?
Okay, there's some halophyte stuff by several governments in various parts of the world. The UAE is involved in some, Egypt's involved in some, so forth. The
But
Boeing, as I said,
are these still very much at a public level? Is there any commercial involvement in these projects?
What they're trying to do is to do demonstration farms so that they can get the data to figure out what the profits would be, because then they can get the costs and they can get what value they produce. Okay, there's a man in Australia that I can provide the people to, his contacts, that's been working halophytes for quite a while, and he has ways to both desalinate land with them and to do fodder, particularly because that's the easiest one to do. He can, tell you chapter and verse, who's in this industrially and so forth and so on. Hazel Henderson, okay, who was associated with this community. Many people listening probably know her. In fact, I think Hazel is listening. Has the information about the various people. She's been a central person involved in working with me. I've been working with her on trying to educate people on the halophytes. So there is no huge corporation pursuing halophytes. Okay, this is a very much of a new pasture to be used. There's a lot of interest in individual people as they've learned about halophytes to incorporate. I was approached by the plenipotentiary for Aruba, which is in the Caribbean. It's a tourist island. It's a desert tourist island owned by the Netherlands. So I went up to talk to her. And this is a desert island. They have to import all their food. all of their energy, water. It's hard. Okay, it's very expensive. So I told her about Halophytes, and so there's things like that. Okay, around the world, but this is a tremendous opportunity because it has not become what I would term industrially resourced, okay, to become a major industry.
So we need a Monsanto, one of the large agricultural firms, to actually get heavily engaged with this.
Something of that size, but not, in terms of renewable energy. All right, we don't see Exxon, taking a lead in renewable energy. Okay,
Yet.
I don't see the existing freshwater agriculture taking a renewable, pioneering interest in this.
That's absolutely fascinating. I was going to ask you a little, a final question, which is about the use of halophytes and GMOs. Presumably, there is work going on with genetic modification of halophytes, or the snipping of halophyte genes and insertion into standard crops. Do you think there'll be IP issues around this, because the way there were with Roundup Ready maize and soybeans?
Most of the halophyte literature right now is scientific literature. It's being studied in a whole bunch of universities all around the world. Seriously. I gave you the 20 countries where there's some, national investment and so forth in the science and the test crops and all kinds of other things. This will happen. It will happen because it has to happen to help us solve climate and the ecosystem. We're running out of water. We're running out of food. Okay. We are currently, even with the renewables and the storage has dropped 70% in cost in the last 3 years. Okay. Well, all of that's developing rapidly, but not rapidly enough. Okay. There are 6 positive feedbacks on climate. The estimates are, as these quicken, methane out of the tundra in the ocean, CO2, fossil CO2 out of the tundra in the ocean, the ice going away, making us less reflective, all of the water going into the atmosphere because of the hotter temperatures. Water is the worst greenhouse gas, and several others like this. The oceans have become weak carbonic acid because of all the CO2 it's taken up, so it's taken up far less. We're cutting down the forests, so the CO2 doesn't go into the forest, and so forth and so on. With these positive feedbacks, there's some guesstimates that by 2100, you can double what the IPCC says. And that's really bad. Okay. And it's going to take something else, people are now, I think, correctly alleging, to get rid of the CO2 out of the atmosphere, as well as quit putting so much in. Okay. And people have been talking about forests, green forests. This is far better, and it does far more. It has many other, this is land, water, food, energy, and climate. It's not just land and climate. Okay. It's also food and energy and water. And so it's better than the forests that people are talking about, and we're going to have to do it. And it's just a matter of how soon and who's smart enough to monetize it. Okay.
Dennis, I think we need 100 more people like you to actually give practical solutions to the troubles we're facing with climate change. Unfortunately, time has flown. Thank you so much for a fascinating and insightful chat. But the time has come for us to say farewell. There's just time for me to thank our sponsors once again and to remind you of some of our forthcoming FS Club events. On Wednesday, the 6th of October, you can hear a webinar on climate change and the financial sector supporting the net zero transition. And on the 11th of October, you can hear about innovative tax schemes for employee share schemes. And on the 13th of October, you can hear about excuse me, you can hear about AI with our webinar entitled Practical Examples at the Cutting Edge of Natural Language Processing. Details on these and lots more besides are available on our website. Dennis, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. I hope you will join us again in the future. Thank you. Bye-bye.